It's 2 minutes to midnight. Sound ominous? Those words might make you shiver even if you've never heard of the Doomsday Clock. What do we really know about the symbolic clock and the end of the world? The Doomsday Clock was the brainchild of a group of scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project, the effort to develop a functioning atomic weapon during World War II. In 1947, the scientists began publishing a bulletin updating the public about nuclear weapons, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. They commissioned landscape painter Martil Langsdorff, who was married to one of the founders of the Bulletin, to create the cover art for the first edition.
He gave no instructions. All he said is, it can't cost much.
Initially, Langsdorff wanted to design the cover around the symbol for uranium, but instead she landed on the clock. Congressman Bill Foster later said in a speech honoring Langsdorff that her clock design, quote, remains a singular reminder of the risks that we face from nuclear weapons and the effects of climate change. Foster said that despite the clock's original narrow focus, the hands of the clock are now used to signal humanity's ability to meet the challenges brought not by just nuclear weapons, but also by climate change. Langsdorff died in 2013 at the age of 96. The first Doomsday Clock was set to 7 minutes to midnight. The choice to set it to 7 minutes was arbitrary. Martil Langsdorff said she chose 7 minutes to midnight because of how it looked on the cover. At some point, scientists at the Bulletin decided the clock would be even more terrifying if the hand appeared to be moving closer to midnight. So in 1949, the magazine's editor Eugene Rabinowitz moved the hand forward a full 4 minutes, turning 7 minutes into just 3. But they actually did have a fairly good reason to be concerned. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, starting a global arms race. It was at that time that the scientists decided to use the clock to help inform the public about the state of global security. The Bulletin apparently likes to keep us guessing by moving the clock's hand back and forth. The number of minutes we all have left to live has been changed over 20 times since 1947. In 2020, the clock came closer than ever to the end, with a time marking 100 seconds to midnight. The Bulletin editor John Mecklin noted that nuclear war and climate change were two major threats to human civilization, compounded by the presence of cyber warfare. Board President Rachel Bronson added, "As far as the Bulletin and the Doomsday Clock are concerned, the world has entered into the realm of the 2-minute warning, a period when danger is high and the margin for error is low." At this point, you might be wondering why you should pay attention to the Doomsday Clock. It sounds like just a bunch of propaganda by a few unknown scientists who seem to value their own opinions pretty highly. But there is some reason to listen to these people. Among these unknown scientists are 15 Nobel laureates, and Nobel Prizes aren't exactly the easiest thing to come by. Odds are they at least kinda know what they're talking about. According to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the Science and Security Board is the main body responsible for the position of the Doomsday Clock's hands. The people on this board possess deep knowledge of nuclear and climate sciences, and they also tend to be the people who give scientific and technological advice to other nations and international agencies. So not only are they very smart people, they're very smart people with power and influence, which makes them pretty hard to ignore. And they clearly believe in the righteousness of what they're doing. If the end of the world does come, you know at least one of them will be crawling through the ashes of Armageddon to set the clock to midnight. In 1991, the Science and Security Board figured it was 17 minutes to midnight until the apocalypse. That's the farthest a clock has ever been from midnight, which really doesn't seem very far at all. If you think of Doomsday as midnight on New Year's Eve, then 17 minutes before midnight is when you're going to get your champagne out of the fridge. In other words, the Science and Security Board wasn't really making anyone more comfortable by moving the hand back so far. But why was the clock so far from midnight in 1991? Well, for one thing, that year marked the end of the Cold War and the beginning of non-hostile cooperation between America and the Soviet Union. For a few minutes, it even looked like maybe both countries would be reducing their nuclear arsenals. By the end of the year, the Soviet Union had dissolved, bringing an end to a prolonged, intense period in world history. In 1953, biophysicist Eugene Rabinowitz wrote an article for the Bulletin which began, "The hands of the clock of doom have moved again. Only a few more swings of the pendulum and from Moscow to Chicago, atomic explosions will strike midnight for Western civilization." What prompted Rabinowitz's Shakespearean musings about pendulums and near certain annihilation? It was the dual pursuit of even bigger bombs by the United States and the Soviet Union. The prior year, the US decided nuclear wasn't good enough, transitioning to full hydrogen. In an effective demonstration of the power of these devices, the military blew up an entire islet in the Pacific Ocean with a thermonuclear device. 9 months later, the Soviet Union tested a hydrogen bomb of its own. In retrospect, the world was probably like 15 seconds to midnight during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist didn't tell anyone that at the time. In 1962, when the crisis was unfolding, the clock was still set to 7 minutes to midnight, having not been moved since 1960. It's not like the clock moves immediately. In January 2017, Lawrence Krauss, the former chairman of the board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, told NPR that the board doesn't put a lot of weight onto individual events, preferring instead to base decisions on global trends and the broad political climate. Also, no one really knew what was happening during the Cuban Missile Crisis until it was over. With that in mind, the Bulletin decided not to freak everyone out by changing the clock based on an event that was already in the past. Up until 2007, the only thing the Doomsday Clock and its co-conspirators measured was the threat of nuclear war, because for most of that time, nuclear war was the only disaster people could really imagine that might actually destroy the planet. Then came climate change.
Right now, we are looking at imminent landfall of this storm.
That year, when the Bulletin moved the hands forward from 7 minutes to midnight to 5 minutes to midnight, they cited the rise of a second nuclear age, and for the first time, climate change. They wrote, "Damage to ecosystems is already taking place. Flooding, destructive storms, increased drought, and polar ice melt are causing loss of life and property." The really annoying thing about the Doomsday Clock is its design. Most of the time, it's just depicted as the upper left quarter of a clock, which implies that the timeline will always be pretty much within the last 15 minutes of life on Earth. Besides being a not very optimistic look into the future, the clock's design has some fundamental problems, most notably the absence of a point of reference that people can use to actually gauge how dire 2 minutes, 5 minutes, or 10 minutes actually is. Where, for example, would the clock have been during Paleolithic times? 11 p.m., 7 a.m.? And what does that say about the fate of the Neanderthals who went through their own doomsday on the way to going extinct? Did they get their own clock? Basically, the answer is, don't think about it too hard. According to Wired, Eugene Rabinowitz explained it like this: "The clock is intended to reflect basic changes in the level of continuous danger in which mankind lives in the nuclear age." In January 2018, the board moved the hands back to 2 minutes to midnight. What compelled the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist to move us all the way back to Cold War levels of potential Armageddon? The board said it was, quote, "the failure of President Trump and other world leaders to deal with looming threats of nuclear war and climate change." In 2020, a statement from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist read, "Humanity continues to face two simultaneous existential dangers, nuclear war and climate change, that are compounded by a threat multiplier, cyber-enabled information warfare that undercuts society's ability to respond. The international security situation is dire, not just because these threats exist, but because world leaders have allowed the international political infrastructure for managing them to erode." But that's not all. The board's list of reasons for putting us on the verge of total destruction also includes North Korea's missile program, the frosty relationship between the US and Russia, Iran's nuclear ambitions, loss of public trust in the media and other institutions, disinformation on the internet, and even artificial intelligence. Still, the Bulletin's chief executive Rachel Bronson said nuclear affairs were the biggest issue the world was facing, stating, "To call the world's nuclear situation dire is to understate the danger in its immediacy." Not everyone thinks the Doomsday Clock was a good idea. Over the years, critics have made arguments ranging from the idea that scaring people isn't very productive to the possibility that the data the clock is based on is all wrong. In 2015, researcher Dr. Anders Sandberg wrote for The Conversation that there's really no way to truly estimate the probability of global annihilation because there are too many subjective factors. In other words, you can't make accurate predictions based on broad assumptions. The Doomsday Clock scares us because it was designed to. According to The Breakthrough, the scientists who gifted us the clock did it because they wanted to convince us that the threat of global annihilation was real enough to demand our attention. Sort of the scientist equivalent of standing around on street corners with a sandwich board.
The world is coming to an end.
But critics of the Doomsday Clock think that's going too far. Some say the focus on apocalyptic scenarios distracts us from smaller risks that could eventually add up to the big bad. Other critics think predicting the end of the world really does nothing but paralyze everyone into inaction. It's much easier to pop that bottle of champagne and watch the end come than to try and find a solution. Now, if you think that the apocalypse is imminent and literally minutes away, don't panic. Here's some reassurance. The clock can be turned back again, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist was kind enough to tell us how. In their 2020 statement, they urged US and Russian leaders to essentially be nice to each other and work together. They asked that countries recommit to the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement and for citizens to further demand that their governments take major action on climate change. Furthermore, governments all over the world can commit to policies aimed at preventing cyber warfare that undermines and threatens democracy. Editor John Mecklin wrote, "We believe that mass civic engagement will be necessary to compel the change the world needs. So do your part as a concerned citizen, but maybe still make sure you also have some champagne stashed away in that bunker. You're gonna need it." Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more messed up history videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.